Welcome to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood Coleman, the Chief Editorial Officer and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. The war in Ukraine has been raging for 1 month, so I'd like to take some time to talk about the landscape as it stands now. The vital port city of Mariupol was a study in Russian aggression, cruelty, and war crimes. A siege was underway, with civilians enduring intolerably inhumane conditions. Russia had laid waste to Mariupol, destroying 90% of all infrastructure. The death toll in Mariupol from the start of the war was up to 2,500 civilians in that city alone. Russia was bombing buildings clearly marked as housing civilians. The inhumane conditions took on a chilling dimension when the Mariupol City Council said that thousands of the city's residents had been forcibly removed from their homes and sent to camps in remote parts of Russia. Let me repeat that. They were sent to camps in remote parts of Russia. The forced removal of Mariupol residents, as well as their relocation to camps in Russia, were together reminiscent of Stalin's legacy during the Soviet era. As the barrage on the besieged city of Mariupol continued, Russia demanded that Ukrainians surrender in exchange for safe passage out of the town. Ukraine refused. Meanwhile, fierce fighting was taking place in Kyiv, with certain suburbs changing hands between Russian forces and Ukrainian defenders. But according to the Kyiv Independent, Ukrainian forces managed to push Russian forces back to about 55 kilometers or 34 miles outside the capital of Kyiv. There were indications that Ukraine was not simply taking on a defense posture, but also going on the offensive. Yet, there were some warnings from military experts that Ukraine's fierce resistance would not be enough in the long run to overpower Russia's military. They've cautioned that Russia's scorched earth precedents in Chechnya and Syria would eventually yield an appalling death toll, humanitarian catastrophe, and the complete devastation of cities. Already, as many as 10 million Ukrainians, almost a quarter of Ukraine's population, had been forced to flee their homes, according to the United Nations. Even if the estimates that 10,000, let's say 15,000 Russian troops in Ukraine had been killed in action, if that were true, that would mean around 180,000 remained alive and able to fight. Accordingly, it would be prudent not to grow overconfident about the Ukrainian resistance efforts. On the other side of the equation, however, was the fact that despite Russia being in possession of superior military assets on paper, its execution of the war in Ukraine had proved to be inferior. Russian forces were tactically and logistically unprepared for its mission in Ukraine. From supply line obstacles to food shortages and no known overriding commanders in the field, there was a clear lack of preparedness. An assessment by the Institute for the Study of War 1 month after the start of the war was as follows, and I quote, "Ukrainian forces have defeated the initial Russian campaign of this war. Its culmination is creating conditions of stalemate throughout most of Ukraine." Unquote. In related developments, the United States has formally declared that Russian armed forces committed war crimes in Ukraine. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made the declaration in an official statement and said that the United States was committed to pursuing accountability using every tool available, including criminal prosecutions. The United States top diplomat noted that the United States had observed attacks deliberately targeting civilians and atrocities. While accusations of war crimes in battle zones often come from human rights organizations, journalists, and media pundits, they rarely come from the government of a developed country. The United States' decision to do so formally, and in such scathing terms, could only be regarded as unprecedented. In Russia, the Kremlin has refused to rule out using nuclear weapons. In an interview with CNN's Christiana Amanpour, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Russia would only use nuclear weapons if its very existence was threatened. Pressed by Amanpour to state whether he was convinced or confident that Putin would not use the nuclear option in Ukraine, Peskov indicated that Russia had a concept of domestic security, and that if there was an existential threat to Russia, then nuclear weapons could be used in accordance with that concept. With Russia having already placed Russian nuclear forces on high alert, and with Peskov suggesting that the nuclear option remained on the proverbial table, the unthinkable was now very much a possibility. Some of the stories I've covered and I will also be covering in the future involve Putin's next target. I've mentioned before that Moldova, which is not a NATO country, and where Russian forces have an entry point via the disputed territory of Transnistria, it's very much low-hanging fruit. Of course, given the lack of international action, including on the part of NATO, in punishing Russia for seizing Crimea, it was barely conceivable that NATO would act to save Moldova's territorial integrity should Russia choose to incorporate Transnistria. To date, Russia has paid no price for its actions in the Russian-speaking regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which remain officially under Georgian jurisdiction. As well, sanctions and condemnations against Russia for annexing Crimea has resulted in only mocking responses from the Russian political class. And as of 2022, Russia has been carrying out a brutal war in Ukraine, clearly with imperialist ambitions. Although Russia was preoccupied with the project of brutalizing Ukraine into submission, should it succeed, it was possible that Transnistria, and that being Moldova, would be next on the target list. While one might think that Russia has its hands full with Ukraine, it would not be musing about invading other countries under normal circumstances. At a war rally, a Kremlin singer, Olev Gazmanov, sang an anthem about incorporating Moldova into Russia. Among the lines of the song were Ukraine and Crimea, Belarus and Moldova, that is my country. The clip of this song at the pro-war rally set off alarm bells in the Moldovan capital of Chisinau regarding Vladimir Putin's more expansive ambitions in Eastern Europe. Moving to Western Europe, United States President Joe Biden has traveled to Brussels, Belgium to meet with NATO partners to discuss the war in Ukraine. I'll cover the decisions made from those talks in the next edition. I'll also be doing an assessment of some of the key weapons being dispatched by allies to Ukraine. Also on my agenda, I'm going to be covering the rules of war and engagement of war, and the delicate balance President Joe Biden is trying to retain so that the war in Ukraine does not turn into an international security catastrophe. Central to that is the careful and yet extensive use of intelligence operations on the border of NATO countries without veering into Ukrainian territory, and the conveyance of that intelligence to Ukraine while omitting sources and methods. Now to a quick rundown of other developments on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has conducted its most significant missile test in years. This launch by Pyongyang makes clear that North Korea's 5-year moratorium on long-range weapons testing is over. Quite possibly, this launch involved the Hwasong-17 and constitutes part of the North's 8th Party Congress goal to develop an ICBM with a 15,000-kilometer range. The election of Yoon Suk-yeol as the new conservative hardline president of South Korea also augurs a different response from the South than we have seen in recent years. Seoul may engage in a more confrontational approach with Pyongyang. But let's also have some good news. After a 16-month war between Ethiopian forces and Tigrayan fighters, a humanitarian truce has been declared. This is a positive development for the Horn of Africa. Across the globe in the United States Senate was conducting hearings for the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson for the Supreme Court. If confirmed, she would be the first black woman to serve on the highest court of the land. Finally, I end with the acknowledgement of the death of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a trailblazer in her own right as the first female Secretary of State in the United States history. For those of us who have made our living writing about the world and with attention to the security of the world, Madeleine Albright stands as the indispensable role model. Rest in peace, Madame Secretary. Subscribers can read more about these and other stories at the Country Watch website at www.countrywatch.com. I'd also like to mention my Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunset in the Graveyard of Empires, which is available for purchase at the Country Watch website at www.countrywatch.com. Thank you for your time. Have a great day, and remember now more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.